The devil went down to Georgia and he was looking for a soul to steal. He was in a bind and willing hide and willing to make a deal. When he came across this young man picking a guitar and playing it hot, the devil jumped up on a hickory stump, said, "Boy, let me tell you what. Well, I guess you didn't know it, but I'm a guitar player too. And if you care to take this dare, I'll make a bet with you. You're a pretty damn good strummer, boy, but give the devil his due. I'll bet a guitar of gold against your soul that says I'm better than you." But the boy said, "My name's Johnny, and it might be a sin, but I'll take your bet. You're gonna regret I'm the best that's ever been."
All right, folks, welcome back. So in our last video, we saw that capitalism might have begun to emerge in the American North in the decades after the Constitution was written. It may have indeed begun in the decade that the Constitution was written, but it was in, at most, its earliest stages. It can't have been assumed in its full-fledged form by the framers in 1787. Instead, there was a historical process by which capitalism was invented in America, as it was simultaneously invented in other parts of the world. And indeed, the Supreme Court changed its understanding of the contract clause over the next 100 years as capitalism was invented. But at the same time, as Gordon Wood has suggested, some people then also invented a story about the constitutional era, trying to say that capitalism had been there from the start. So we're going to settle this fight. We're going to actually take a look at some of the earliest contract clause cases to see how their theory of the contract clause changed over the course of time. Chief Justice John Marshall, who we've looked at before, who many say actually leaned back towards pre-capitalist, non-market notions of the world, he understood the contract clause just very differently than later justices did, as we'll see. And we're going to see that in his opinion from Trustees of Dartmouth College versus Woodward. This is one of the first cases to enforce the contract clause to invalidate a state action that was done for the public good. So the court decided in 1819 that Dartmouth College had been formed as a, quote, corporate body by a grant from the King of England, and argued that this grant to act as a corporation was sacred and inviolable for all time. Those are Marshall's words. The state of New Hampshire could never void that contract or even alter it. But in many ways, as we're going to see, the backlash against this case defined the beliefs of the early 1800s as much as the case itself did. The people opposed the notion that private contracts were somehow inviolable against the states. So the citizens of New Hampshire argued that, well, sometimes they needed protections from the contracts that other people made, not just protections of the contracts that they themselves made from state interference. All right, folks, so here are the facts. This case arose when the president of Dartmouth College was removed by its trustees, leading to the New Hampshire legislature attempting to force the college to become a public institution so that the governor of New Hampshire could appoint new trustees and reinstate the recently removed president. The Supreme Court upheld the, quote, sanctity of the original charter of the college, which predated even the state of New Hampshire. In 1769, King George III of Great Britain had granted a charter to Dartmouth College, and that document spelled out the purpose of the school, it set up the structure to govern it, and it gave land to the college for it to be able to operate as well. And it was then 47 years later, in 1816, I'll remind you that's 40 years after the American Revolution began, that the legislature of New Hampshire attempted to alter Dartmouth's charter to save the college's president in the way that I just explained. The trustees of the college objected, and they sought to have the actions of the legislature defined as unconstitutional. So here's how to understand the rule that Marshall articulated in this case. The decision in 1819 ruled in favor of the college, and it invalidated the acts of the New Hampshire legislature, which in turn allowed Dartmouth to continue as a private institution. The opinion was based upon Marshall's belief in the sanctity of a contract. So the court ruled that the college's corporate charter qualified as a contract between private parties, the king and the trustees. And that was the contract that the legislature could not interfere with because of the clause now in the Constitution. Even though the United States were no longer royal colonies, the contract was still valid because the Constitution said that a state could not pass laws to impair a contract. But the Dartmouth decision was very unpopular at the time, and public outcry ensued upon this decision. Popular opinion influenced a lot of state courts and legislatures to declare that state governments had an absolute right to amend or repeal a corporate charter at will, even contracts that had been made in the past. As in Dartmouth, we were looking at a contract that had been made before the Constitution was even passed. Now, the courts mostly struck these very aggressive laws down. Some states then actually responded by passing laws giving states the general right to alter any contract made in the future, and higher courts upheld those laws. Sure, the courts balked sometimes, saying that the sort of alteration of private charters has to be at least reasonable if a state tries to do it. It cannot cause harm to certain members of the corporation, the founders and the stockholders and the like. But they admitted that the power of the state to do this existed. Or in other words, and this is really important for understanding the Dartmouth case, courts applying the Dartmouth rule had to admit that if the state's right to alter a contract was an assumed background of all contracts when they were made, then the parties to the contract really couldn't complain later when the state decided to do this. So far from separating the market entirely from politics and creating a market society where all individual choice was governed by the market and the market alone, Dartmouth, the case, and its aftermath instead established that the power of the state could be an assumed prior condition to private market contracts. And that is, again, if the states passed such a law and all the parties to the contract knew it, then the state reserved to itself the right to alter future contracts. Now, it is assuredly right to point out, as most textbooks do, that the Dartmouth case played a major role in establishing rules to protect private corporations from the state. Yeah, absolutely. But this simply wasn't decided on a modern understanding of what corporations are. In Dartmouth, corporations do not escape the power of the state because the market, whatever that is outside of the state, whatever that means. They escape subsequent power only when there's an express state grant of powers to the corporation, which is unalterable only because it is prior, since the grant of corporate power rested in the state's power to give to begin with. Or to put it in simple terms, you can't tell me later that you're going to take something away from me unless you had told me before that you reserved that power yourself. But sometime after, Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge used the contract clause to usher in actually a new understanding of what corporate bodies were actually given when they were chartered by the state. It too was a step on the way to capitalism, but we're going to see now, not a complete or a final step. Okay, so the facts. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts had chartered the Charles River Bridge Corporation to build a bridge and charge tolls to cross it. It was very successful, in fact, but as the local economy grew, the Commonwealth chartered another bridge downstream, the Warren Bridge, which eventually became free to users, causing the Charles River Bridge, for obvious reasons, to lose customers. Then when this case first came before the Supreme Court in 1831, it actually took them a couple of years to decide, Chief Justice Marshall leaned towards forbidding Massachusetts to do this. Under something like the reasoning of Dartmouth, Massachusetts couldn't take from the Charles River Bridge Company what it had given them by contract, which here, notice, was the right to make money from their tolls. That is, by their charter, they were given a right to future income sources. You're going to see that becomes complicated in just a second. It's actually an old understanding of contracts. And you see also here, if a contract is considered sacred and inviolable, then Marshall's theory was in fact anti-competitive, not capitalist. But when the case was finally decided in 1837, the new Chief Justice, Roger Taney, and other new justices declared that old theory was dead. And they argued that the grant from Massachusetts was not a grant of monopoly, as Marshall just assumed was true of all corporate charters that didn't explicitly say otherwise. But the new court said it was simply a grant to do business in a competitive environment. So here's the rule that Taney articulated. Though the Constitution says nothing about markets at all, Taney and his compatriots assumed that the theory of the Constitution was a theory of making contracts within competitive markets, with dynamic changes being possible within these markets. Whereas Marshall had assumed just 18 earlier that a contract was a static thing, sacred and inviolable at the moment it was sealed, Taney and his compatriots assumed that conditions can change and you've got no real right to object to that. So do you see the difference from the Dartmouth case? Marshall thought any contract was basically a monopoly. Any grant of power to a corporation was an exclusive grant of power to that corporation. Courts, as I said just after Dartmouth, allowed states to alter their grants if they had said ahead of time that they weren't monopoly grants. In both cases, this was the old theory that a corporate contract was sacred and inviolable only as it was written, not that it was private or outside of state power. Now, here's something you got to know. It was genuinely unclear at the time what it meant when a state granted a charter to a corporation. In 1785, Massachusetts had granted the Charles River Bridge Company the right to build a bridge and collect tolls on it for 40 years. A few years after that, they extended the time period to 70 years. Now, back in Elizabethan England, the Crown almost always granted a monopoly over some enterprise when it granted a charter. So, for instance, and this is not a joke, the right to make shirt starch for those high ruffled collars that the Elizabethan court wore. They granted a monopoly with respect to that. Sometimes then the Crown would later burst in and grant someone else the right to do the same type of business, make the same type of starch. And everybody said this was wrong, and everyone said this was wrong, but not necessarily because of the original grant of monopoly power, but because the promise had been broken. Oh, sure, there were people that complained, and there were authors writing at the time who said that monopolies were making prices higher for everyone, but the monopolists really only complained that they had been explicitly granted a monopoly to do the thing like making shirt starch, only to have it pulled later, making them compete. And competition was considered dirty and dishonorable, especially for the aristocratic classes. In the United States, it was unclear whether a grant of a corporate charter was meant to be a monopoly or competitive. The Charles River Bridge Company argued that their right wouldn't have been limited to 40 or to 70 years unless the intention had been to grant them the exclusive right for that time, the exclusive right to the tolls, the exclusive right to a profit, a monopoly. The Warren Bridge Company argued, on the other hand, that none of this was made explicit in the contract, so it just couldn't be true. In his opinion, Taney leaned towards the Warren Bridge Company's argument for reasons that we'll see in a second, but he argued that the case was strictly about the interpretation of the Charles River Bridge Company's contract and that the charter contract should be interpreted as narrowly as possible. Now, this meant for him that the Charles River Bridge did not have exclusive monopoly rights because it wasn't said in the contract. And he also stated that in general, public grants should be interpreted strictly, and if there's ever any uncertainty in a contract, the decision should be made in such a way that it betters the public. So he says this, for instance, on page 548 of the decision, if you want to look at the full thing later. I know in your readings you only had a summary of it. The full thing is actually really interesting to read as well. He says, while the rights of private property are sacredly guarded, we must not forget that the community also have rights, and that the happiness and well-being of every citizen depends on their faithful preservation. Taney also wrote about the negative effects on the country if the court had sided with the Charles River Bridge Company. He said transportation would be affected around the whole country. And he made the point that with the rise of infrastructure in the country, canals and railroads had started to take away business from highways. And if all charters granted monopolies to corporations, then these necessary improvements, as he called them, the railways, the canals, all of them could be blocked by earlier charters. If that was the case, then, Taney said on page 553, the country would be thrown back to the improvements of the last century and obliged to stand still. And here you clearly see here the Lockean focus on the word improvements and the use of state power in such a way as to foster these improvements for the public good. So the Charles River Bridge case really marked a milestone in the process of major changes in the assumptions of the law to where it was now possible for judges to assume for the first time that competition was the backdrop to the now 50-year-old Constitution and its contract clause. But it was not, of course, assumed in the Constitution itself. It was brought about anew in this case. And as you can see, there's still no assumption in the Charles River Bridge case that competitive markets occur outside of the state. Oh, private property is protected as much as possible, sure, but the people, through their legislatures, can regulate it too. And especially, their states have the power to regulate competitive markets and corporations to ensure that those things actually end up working to produce the best possible public outcomes. Now, it took at least another 50 years for American law to change enough to actually become capitalist through and through. By the time of the Lochner versus New York decision in 1905, it was possible for judges to argue that the Constitution made contracts so inviolable that citizens could not get any protection from the forces of the market, even by passing popular laws in their states. Okay, here's the law that's at issue in the Lochner decision. In Lochner, a maximum hours law mandating that employers could not force employees to work more than a 60-hour week was overturned by the court. You're used to the idea of a 40-hour week. This law simply tried to cap it at 60 hours. So the protections that the citizens of New York had voted for themselves as workers simply could not, the court reasoned, withstand the imperatives of competitive capitalism, now their assumption behind the contract clause. So Justice Peckham stated the court's new rule on page 57. There is no reasonable ground for interfering with the liberty of person or the right of free contract by determining the hours of labor in the occupation of a baker. There is no contention that bakers as a class are not equal in intelligence and capacity to men in other trades or manual occupations, or that they are not able to assert their rights and care for themselves without the protecting arm of the state interfering with their independence of judgment and of action. They are in no sense wards of the state. So Peckham is saying here that the bakers who were specifically mentioned in the New York statute were not wards of the state, he says. That is, that they had also to go out on the competitive markets. And even if the state of New York thought that the owners of the bakeries, the capitalists, had a significant amount of power over them, and so therefore contracts against them might be unfair or tilted towards the capitalists, Peckham was saying, no, they too had to enter into a competitive market for wage services, just like the capitalists were in a competitive market for the money to start their bakeries. And they all had to sort of compete, even with each other. But Justice Holmes famously responded that it was simply not within the province of the Supreme Court, again, to use Justice Marshall's original language there, that it was simply not within the province of the Supreme Court to decide how to balance the rights of the employees against the rights of the employers, the rights of the bakers against the rights of the bakeries. He said on page 75 of the decision, "This case is decided upon an economic theory which a large part of the country does not entertain. If it were a question whether I agreed with that theory, I should desire to study it further and long before making up my mind. But I do not conceive that to be my duty, because I strongly believe that my agreement or disagreement has nothing to do with the right of a majority in a state to embody their opinions in law." Holmes recognized what was undeniable, that Lochner was based on a theory. Dartmouth also had been based on a theory. The theory there was simply that the sanctity of a contract was important for predictability. I needed to be able to predict my future. But if I knew ahead of time that the state could alter certain clauses in a contract, I could still at least predict what it was that I owned, whether it was the case that I had monopoly power, what it was I could do under my charter, and so forth. Charles River Bridge had also been based on a theory that the court ought to weigh whether competition, in the case of ambiguous charter grants at least, would help the overall public or harm it. Then, only when it was unclear, they could prefer competition as a background assumption. Lochner finally was based on the theory that, regardless of the consequences to the public, the contract clause enshrined utterly free choice. Holmes responded to this on page 75 in what became one of the most famous sentences ever from a Supreme Court case. When you look at all the famous sentences ever, it's amazing how many of them were from Oliver Wendell Holmes. But he said, "The 14th Amendment does not enact Mr. Herbert Spencer's social statics." Holmes didn't think competition was crucial to the contract clause above all else at the expense of all else. That, he said, was a modern theory, the theory of Herbert Spencer, the theory of social Darwinism. That, he said, was not the founders' theory. And we've seen in these lectures how Holmes might have been right about that. And I only have one last thing to point out to you. Notice that Holmes is also expressing a theory of judicial review in his opinion. He is indeed consistent throughout his court opinions on this. It's not the place of the court, he always says, to assert theories of what the Constitution means, but instead to defer to legislatures when the meaning of the Constitution is ambiguous and they have legitimate interpretations of what their powers are. As he says in Lochner on page 75, I do not conceive that to be my duty because I strongly believe that my agreement or disagreement has nothing to do with the right of a majority in a state to embody their opinions in law. Or as he said famously in a letter to Harold Lasky, I always say, as you know, that if my fellow citizens want to go to hell, I will help them. It's my job. Or in other words, Holmes would defer to legislatures even if he believed them to be egregiously wrong. It wasn't his place to insert a theory of the Constitution into its ambiguous phrases. He had to call balls and strikes in a modern analogy. Now, we're going to see thinkers later in the term who think it's impossible to interpret the Constitution without a theory. So I look forward to having that debate as we continue our class over time. I look forward also to talking with you about the Contracts Clause. All right, I'll see you soon.